His book tour this weekend, confirming in a series of interviews that he opened a counterintelligence investigation into President Trump after the firing of FBI Director James Comey. McCabe even suggesting that the president might be a Russian asset.
Do you still believe the president could be a Russian asset?
I think it's possible. I think that's why we started our investigation, and I'm really anxious to see where Director Mueller concludes that.
All this amid new reports that the Mueller probe is wrapping up, and as former Trump fixer Michael Cohen prepares to testify on Capitol Hill next week. Let's bring in James Trusty. He is a former Justice Department prosecutor. Welcome. Good to have you here again. So let's start with the McCabe revelation that he and the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein talked about the idea of invoking the 25th Amendment to replace President Trump. Have you ever heard of anything like that before?
No, it's pretty outlandish, and I feel that way really for two different reasons. One is McCabe and one is Rosenstein. McCabe has serious credibility problems. The Inspector General found that he lied on multiple occasions, including lying about the last conversation with the Inspector General. He's on a book tour. He's got a criminal referral out there, and he's got a lot of axes to grind as he goes on these softball interviews. On the other side of it, I know Rod Rosenstein. I know him to be a career prosecutor, a guy who's very stand-up and ethical and also very intelligent about the Constitution. I can't imagine for a moment that Rod would ever think the 25th Amendment was remotely in play. It's about disability, not dislike. And so I think on both ends of the spectrum there's some serious credibility questions surrounding Mr. McCabe's allegations.
So Rosenstein has said he was in no position to be able to invoke the 25th Amendment. Of course, he wasn't, but he doesn't deny that he may have he raised the issue. So I mean, maybe this was just the turmoil of the time, the kind of chaos after the Comey firing that might have come up.
Yeah, I don't think it would have come up in a straight-laced way. I think it's possible that Rosenstein was sarcastic, dismissive of the notion. But you also have to remember, I think, when DOJ issues these denials, they're being very careful not to expose fuller, more detailed investigative conversations. So I think he's kind of hitting back with one arm behind his back rather than being able to give a full-throated response to what McCabe is saying.
So you'd like to see him testify, as Lindsey Graham has said to the Senate Judiciary Committee about all this with Rod Rosenstein? Would that could be helpful, I suppose?
I think it'd be helpful. I don't know if I wish that on any of my friends or my enemies, but the reality is I think Rod will hold up very well in front of Congress when it comes to this type of questioning. I don't think he has anything to hide. And I think there's a big comparison, a stark difference between him and McCabe when it comes to how they'll perform.
Just in terms of the Constitution, if you are somebody in an administration, and you think the President of the United States is in some ways compromised, isn't your obligation to presumably resign and to then state why you're resigning? And under the Constitution, the remedy for something like that is impeachment. Go to Congress and say, look, this president is compromised, can't fulfill his duties, and I'm willing to testify to that effect.
Right. I think that's the honorable kind of law enforcement approach to it, and that's what seems so out of place when you talk about McCabe and Comey, going on The View, doing book tours. It's just a different politicized world at the FBI top reaches recently, and I think even a lot of rank-and-file FBI agents that I know are welcoming the change and the scrutiny and want to see kind of a different attitude from the top of their organization than they're seeing from these guys.
All right, so let's talk about where Robert Mueller stands right now. A lot of talk, media reports that somehow this is going to be over soon, and he'll issue a report or tell new Attorney General Bill Barr that he is wrapping up. Where do you see this at the present moment?
Well, I think there's a lot of reason to think that it is at the finish line. I mean, part of it goes back to the fact that President Trump was given a take-home assignment, that he was given written questions. That sounded like something that was more checking a box than trying to get an incriminating answer. The fact that sentencings are starting to happen for either failed or breached cooperators, that tells me they're not trying to preserve them for trial testimony. And I think there's been personnel movement where a lot of people have left the Mueller investigative team, the prosecutors, back to their home agencies. So I think that all makes sense that we're heading towards a finish line. What's interesting is getting a report to the Attorney General doesn't necessarily mean the rest of us see it.
That's right.
So there's a real open question about how it would be released, how much would be released, and what the timing of that would be.
Well, what would be your advice to Bill Barr? Look, I mean, there's an argument for making it public just for the good of the country, to be able to see and lay out what it is, the arguments that he's making. On the other hand, if in fact there isn't a lot of, there's maybe some innuendo about certain individuals in it, you don't want that to be public without charges.
Yeah, look, I don't think Barr needs any guidance from me. He's a pretty steady hand, experienced guy. But I think what he'll probably feel pretty compelled to do is scrub it for truly sensitive information. I don't mean embarrassing. I mean, like, you know, international kind of intelligence community type information that has to be redacted. There may well be some of that. But I also think he realizes in the big picture it's really politically untenable to think that this report would go no further than the president. So I suspect he feels a pretty instant tug to have this thing released. If he releases it to Congress, it'll take all of 7 seconds for it to leak. But I think he'll probably be a strong advocate for full disclosure to everyone.
That makes more sense, just to have him do it without waiting for somebody to leak it and make it look like it's somehow nefarious. That would be my argument. You agree?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it's a political calculation more than a legal one, but I think at the end of the day, you know, dripping it out through leaks or through kind of partisan half stories is not the way to do it. They should just let the whole thing see daylight.
All right, James Trusty, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Sure, thanks.
When we come back, Bernie Sanders launches his 2020 bid amid claims by some Democrats that his moment has come and maybe gone. What the Vermont socialist brings to a field already crowded with progressives. Presidential bid on Tuesday, raising $6 million from more than 225,000 donors in the first 24 hours of his campaign. Sanders joins a rapidly growing Democratic field, but he's wasting no time setting his sights on one opponent in particular.
It is absolutely imperative that Donald Trump be defeated, because I think it is unacceptable and un-American, to be frank with you, that we have a president who is a pathological liar, and it gives me no pleasure to say that, but it's true. We have a president who is a racist, who is a sexist, who is a xenophobe.
Joining the panel this week, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, editorial page writer Jillian Melchior, and editorial board member Kyle Peterson. So, Dan, we'll get to the rhetoric in a bit, but what are the assets that Sanders brings to the campaign?
Well, the biggest asset he brings to the campaign is that he walked in from nowhere in 2015 and 2016 and significantly challenged Hillary Clinton for the nomination. As well, if people forget, back then in most of the head-to-head polling that was done, Bernie was always in a lead of Donald Trump. And people go, how can a 70-something socialist senator from Vermont have this support? Bottom line is, he does. And people are saying he's finished. His time was back then. Guy raised $6 million in one day. And in the beauty contest polling right now, he's just behind Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders has something that appeals to a lot of Democratic voters.
And he has a passionate following, Kyle. And I guess one of his appeals is, I'm the real thing. You want a socialist? I'm a real socialist, okay? I call myself one. None of these trimmers who will sell you out.
Right, but one of the questions is how broad that base is. We know it's deep, we know it's enthusiastic, but I'll give you two numbers. In the 2016 primaries, Bernie Sanders won only about a quarter of black voters, and about a quarter of his primary support did not vote for Hillary Clinton in the general election. So the question is whether he can broaden that support or whether he can take advantage of a divided field here. If there are 20 candidates up on the debate stage, and he can keep a broad, solid 30% of the vote, he could steamroll the nomination the same way that Donald Trump did.
No longer the only left-of-center candidate or progressive in the race, Jillian.
Yeah, I think one remarkable thing is that he has broadened his socialist agenda much more in the Democratic Party. He's the one setting the direction and the path right now.
Medicare for all,
yeah.
Green New Deal,
Green Deal
free college.
Yeah, and I think also he's made socialist not a dirty word anymore. This is something that during the Obama era progressives tiptoed around. It's something that now young people are claiming.
But wait a minute, let me push back on that a bit, because that's true in a certain circles. But Donald Trump clearly aims to make it a dirty word again. He raised it in the State of the Union. And I talk to Democrats who say, look, we really want to beat Trump, but Bernie's too far left to beat Trump. So that electability issue is something we have to think about in the primaries.
Well, I think a lot of Democrats are in that position, to be honest, that their base, the real energy on the party is very far left. So they have to appeal to that to get that primary support. But they risk isolating the broader American public. And I think that's going to be a difficult thing for not just Bernie, but others to navigate.
What about this issue of the rhetoric, Dan? That clip was extraordinary. He called the president basically a liar. He called him homophobic, racist, sexist. I mean, I'm trying to remember when even any political opponent said that about a sitting president.
Yeah, it's very negative, and maybe that's one of the biggest things on the downside of Bernie Sanders. And I would put Elizabeth Warren in there as well. When you're running for the presidency of the United States, it's hard to see how you can run from start to end on such a negative argument like that you find your opponent hateful. You have to provide a more positive vision. I've been a little surprised, to tell you the truth, to hear Sanders go in that direction on Trump, that long, incredible list of things: racist, liar, homophobe, pathological liar. But the Democrats are just consumed with antipathy for Donald Trump. It's now part of their DNA. It seems like something they all feel that they have to do.
But Amy Klobuchar, for one, and I think even Cory Booker, they're critical of Trump, but they're offering a more optimistic view of America.
But this may be part of his play for the identity politics vote. I mean, the identity politics holds a lot of sway in the Democratic Party, and Bernie Sanders is not checking any of those boxes. So he was asked about that this week. How can you lead a diverse Democratic Party? And he paraphrased Martin Luther King and said we need to look at candidates' character. You know, I think we need to move toward a non-discriminatory society. And he got a lot of pushback on that. There were people on the left who said, you know, the idea that somebody's saying identity is not important in this day's and age is just wrong.
So that might be a potential liability, too. But you've done some reporting about Burlington College and his wife's role as a former president there, and the school later went bust. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the college ended up taking out this $10 million loan to acquire land, and to do it...
In Vermont.
In Vermont. It was a college expansion, and to do that, Jane O'Meara Sanders said that they had secured all these fundraising commitments. Well, it turns out that money never came through. The college ended up closing under the crushing weight of debt. But there have been questions about, first of all, why this college that had less than $2 million in net assets was so easily able to get $10 million in loans, whether Bernie Sanders' political influence played into that. And then if you look through some of the financial disclosures that the college filed, lo and behold, more than $300,000 of Burlington College money went to a woodworking school owned by Jane O'Meara Sanders' daughter, Bernie Sanders' stepdaughter. So that looks like a lot like nepotism to many people.
Now, they say, the campaign says, look, the U.S. attorney looked into this. They filed no charges. Nothing is wrong here. Move on. But do you think it's going to be an issue in the campaign?
Absolutely, because higher education was so important to his 2016 momentum. So I already think this is a ripe topic to look into. And then again, if you're looking at socialism, it's got a history of financial incompetence and a tendency toward nepotism. And I think at Burlington College, that's what we've seen. Jane O'Meara Sanders is already a really political figure. She's an advisor. So I think that's something else to keep in mind.
All right. Thank you, Jillian. When we come back, California Governor Gavin Newsom accusing President Trump of political retribution after the administration announces plans to yank federal funds for his bullet train.
I have no interest in sending back $3.5 billion of federal funding that was allocated to this project to President Donald Trump.
An escalation in the battle between President Trump and California Governor Gavin Newsom, with the administration announcing this week that it will cancel more than $900 million in funding for California's high-speed rail project and is actively exploring ways to claw back an additional $2.5 billion that has already been spent. Newsom who announced last week that he is scaling back plans for the 520-mile bullet train from L.A. to San Francisco, called the move political retribution for California's participation in a 16-state lawsuit against President Trump's national emergency declaration. The president himself seemed to tie the two together in a tweet Tuesday, saying, quote, "The failed fast train project in California, where the cost overruns are becoming world record setting, is hundreds of times more expensive than the desperately needed wall." We're back with Dan Henninger, Kyle Peterson, and Wall Street Journal editorial board member Alicia Finley. So, Alicia, this was Jerry Brown, former Governor Jerry Brown's signature project. He said it was about California embracing the future. Now, why would his former lieutenant governor stop the project?
That's right. I'd also point out Arnold Schwarzenegger before him really championed the project as well. Gavin Newsom is just acknowledging reality. There is no course to completing this project. 520 miles from San Francisco to L.A. It's already over 14 years behind schedule. You're looking at the end of the century before it could probably ever get done. And they don't have the money.
What about, how short are they?
They are $40–70 billion short.
40 to
and that's
70
assuming that
billion
doesn't go,
dollars.
there aren't cost overruns.
Okay, so is the president right to ask for the money back?
I think he's exactly right, because California has not been holding up to its end of the bargain. The federal government had a grant agreement with California. It did not. California repeatedly broke it. It did not submit timely reviews and reports. It has missed deadline after deadline. I think it's about time that the federal government yanked money.
But Newsom is saying, look, I'm not killing the whole train, okay? I'm still going to build the Merced to Bakersfield block in the Central Valley. So we're not giving up on the whole project, so you still owe us the money.
That's right. Ironically, that's probably the least popular part of the project. That area of the valley really doesn't like it because it's destroying a lot of property. But even then, that part of the project will still take probably over a decade to complete.
And a lot more money.
And a lot more money.
Does California have the money to build this?
Yes. I mean, if it really wanted to, it has a $21 billion surplus, Gavin Newsom is projecting. It has $1 to $2 billion in cap and trade revenues every year. It has another $5 or $6 billion that it's bringing in from its gas tax. I mean, it just basically wants to free ride on the federal government.
Well, what about the other fights? This is part of a broader brawl between kind of left-leaning California and the Trump administration. You've got a fight over fuel economy standards that broke down this week, the negotiations, so that looks like it's going to end up in court. You got the emergency border declaration that's also ending up in court.
Right. I don't think this is political retribution. Republicans have been talking about the high-speed rail thing, how it doesn't make sense for years, and anybody would have canceled this, any Republican president. But this broader picture is this is how federalism is supposed to work, particularly in an environment where Congress is no longer jealously guarding its own power. I mean,
what do you mean by that? How is this making federalism work?
The counterweight to the president is supposed to be Congress, and since Congress has become kind of a tribal institution that will go along with whatever its party wants, the states are stepping in and kind of fulfilling that role. I mean, you saw this during the last administration when Obamacare came down. A lot of Republican states banded together. Texas was one of the leaders to file lawsuits against it. So this is the natural give and take of the federal system, and there's nothing untoward here.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, I also think that Donald Trump is teeing up California. President Trump is always looking for villains he can fight with, and I think he's going to make California a general villain for his re-election campaign, and this time based on some substantive issues, like the bullet train, like the fuel economy standards. And don't get me wrong, he's fighting with the liberals and the political class in California. The Edelman Institute out there put out a fascinating study this week. 53% of Californians are thinking of leaving the state. Over half the state. 63% of millennials. Yeah, but Dan, half of them probably agree with Trump about all this.
It's one thing to pick a fight with Kim Jong-un or Angela Merkel over something. This is the biggest state in the union. I mean, don't you want to see if you can court them?
He's never going to get their electoral votes.
I don't think he did. I think Gavin Newsom's the ones who's picked the fight, especially on the cafe or the fuel economy standards. I mean, they're the ones that don't want to go along with I shouldn't say go along. They want to set the rules for the rest of the country.
I see. And what happened is that the president
said,
revised the old standards.
Right, and we're going to have a national standard. California cannot set the rules for every other state. This is a federal system.
Has he tried to help California in any way with the fires or with water?
I mean, he's provided flexibility in terms of the water restrictions at the San Joaquin Sacramento Delta. The farmers are very thankful for that. He's also provided some money or federal funds for firefighting.
Okay, all right. Well, this will be fun to watch. Still ahead, as President Trump and Kim Jong-un prepare for a second summit in Vietnam, a look at what to expect from next week's meeting.
Chairman Kim and I have a very good relationship. I wouldn't be surprised to see something work out. But Chairman Kim and I have a very good relationship. I wouldn't be surprised to see something work out.
That was President Trump this week raising the prospect of easing sanctions on North Korea ahead of his second summit with Kim Jong-un in Vietnam. The president saying he did not think North Korea was reluctant to denuclearize, despite the lack of concrete progress since he and Kim first sat down in Singapore in June. So what should we expect when the two meet again next week? Let's ask Bruce Klingner. He's a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation and the former chief of the CIA's Korea branch. Welcome. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So how much progress has there been made since the summit last June?
There's been no progress on denuclearization. In fact, North Korea continues to nuclearize. They've expanded and refined their production facilities for fissile material, reentry vehicles, missiles, and mobile missile launchers. So certainly we're hoping we get concrete, tangible steps towards denuclearization at the Hanoi summit.
The administration officials, what they're saying is, in fact, don't underestimate the degree to the importance of the lack of testing in North Korea since the breakout of détente. You agree with that?
Not really. Of course, North Korea is required not to test under 11 UN resolutions. In fact, they're required to abandon their nuclear and missile programs under those resolutions. And we've had numerous cases in the past of 3 or more years in between nuclear or missile tests. So really, this is not that unusual from the past. Also, Kim Jong-un said late last year, in April of this year, they no longer need to test because they've successfully completed their warhead as well as ICBM programs.
Well, also the president says now that he's really not in a hurry to denuclearize, have the North denuclearize. This can take some time, and he's willing to sort of go, even suggesting here, hasn't said this flat out, but suggesting that maybe you do go on a parallel track. They give something, we give something. They give something, we give something. What do you think of that kind of a strategy?
Well, it certainly is a change from previous administration statements that denuclearization should be done in a year, or at least by the end of the president's first term. I think there have been a number of hints by Special Envoy Began as well as Secretary Pompeo and others that the administration is sort of lowering the bar on a number of issues, not requiring a data declaration by the North as early as they were requiring before, sort of stretching out the timelines, even perhaps some suggestions on sanctions relief before total denuclearization, as they said before.
Well, if that's the case, I mean, you see, it sounds like the United States is the party that's making more of the concessions here. Is that how you're reading? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's I'm kind of reading from inferring from what you're saying.
Well, at Singapore, the denuclearization language was weaker than the September 2005 statement. The U.S. unilaterally canceled military exercises, and there have been 9 military exercises canceled since Singapore and constraints on additional exercises. North Korea has not reduced any of its own military exercises. So far, we haven't really made any progress. We're certainly hoping for more meat to the bones of the next Singapore or the next statement than the previous one.
Well, so here's the other spin I'm getting from the administration as well, and they're saying that, look, we have to have a summit here. even though we haven't had concrete progress, because the only person who can make a concession in North Korea and make it stick is Kim Jong-un. And anybody lower than him who comes over for talks here or elsewhere and makes a concession that Kim decides he doesn't like is frankly risking his life. So you've got to go to the top here, and that's why it has to be Trump versus Kim, even if that's unusual in the history of symmetry. What do you think of that?
Right. Well, that's certainly different from the traditional bottom-up approach. I'm more a fan of that approach where you have, in order to get the very comprehensive, detailed agreement, it's got to be done at the envoy level rather than at the leader level.
Right.
You know, you want to have an agreement more like the arms control treaties with the Soviets, which were 100 pages or more, had very intricate and very rigorous verification requirements. So whether you have the president first reach an agreement and then the envoys detail it out, but you don't want to have unilateral concessions as we did in Singapore. So we need to have progress even on achieving a common definition of what denuclearization is. The special envoy admitted in January that we don't even have an agreed definition of what denuclearization is with North Korea, despite repeated statements by Secretary Pompeo.
So would you expect and think that at a minimum we need to get, that is, the United States needs to get from North Korea at least a declaration of where its nuclear sites are, where its research sites are, and an inventory of the weapons that it has?
Very much. You know, whether we get a very extensive agreement in Hanoi, or at least we need a very firm, unambiguous, public and written declaration by North Korea that they accept the UN definition of denuclearization, which is not global arms control, but rather abandonment of their arsenals as they're required to do. We need a commitment by them on a full and complete data declaration and an acceptance of international standards of verification.
What did you make, you're a former CIA analyst, what did you make of the reports this week that Kim has purged some of the critics of dealing with the United States and as part of some anti-corruption drive? Does this suggest that maybe Kim really is sincere in his denuclearization pledge and we could see some progress?
Well, we've seen purges by Kim Jong-un ever since he came into power in 2011 and 2012, as well as his father had done any number of purges. So we're never quite sure if it's because of corruption or eliminating real or imagined opponents. So I don't think we can directly link it to the people being purged are hardliners who are resistant to a nuclear agreement with the U.S., because Kim's been purging people, including hundreds of people, for quite some time. He even purged and executed someone for falling asleep in a meeting.
Okay, well, that's who the president is dealing with head-to-head. Thank you, Bruce Klingner. Appreciate your being here. Still ahead, from California to Colorado to West Virginia, teachers across the country are walking off the job, and it's not all about the money. A look at what else is behind the recent spate of strikes next. 12% retroactive raise to compensate for what they say are among the lowest salaries for public school teachers in the pricey San Francisco Bay Area. It's just the latest in a series of strikes with teachers across the country walking off the job in recent months, and not just over pay and benefits. West Virginia teachers who went on a 9-day walkout last year ended another 2-day strike this week after Republican Governor Jim Justice promised to veto a bill that would have increased school choice and accountability. We're back with Dan Henninger, Alicia Finley, and Jillian Melcher. So, Jillian, what's really behind this spate of strikes?
Remarkably, not so much salary, although that's secondary. I think many of these teachers' unions are striking because they don't want the competition from charter schools, first off. And second, they don't like their pay being linked to performance. And I think we're seeing a big push for them to use strikes as a way to coerce the government into protecting their position. When
you say pay for performance, you mean student performance in particular.
Exactly.
Graduation rates, mastery of the NAEP tests, the national tests for reading and math. That's what you're talking about?
Yeah.
They want seniority to determine pay.
Yeah, they want seniority. So in West Virginia, you had them saying that you actually can't consider anything but seniority for layoffs. In Denver, a big sticking point was whether or not you'd give bonuses for better student performance. So yeah, I think these teachers' unions, end of the day, they want to be protected. They want to know that they're going to get the union perks and not have the competition.
And on the issue of performance, performance is poor. Mm-hmm. I mean, if scores on tests in most of these districts is below anything that's acceptable. Parents realize this, inner city parents, and so many of them are migrating to charter schools to get their kids out of these public schools, and the unions are becoming desperate about losing their franchise.
Well, but Alicia, is this working? I mean,
well, that's why they keep doing it. It worked last year in Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia. They got pay raises.
Big pay raises.
Big pay raises. And then every time in LA, they got somewhat of a pay raise. But the problem is the school reformers are not going on offense, and they are not actually strongly advocating for these reforms because they've become a little timid in the Trump era because the unions have managed to create this narrative that these are for-profit charter schools promoted by Betsy DeVos, and they're scaring a lot of liberal school reformers.
Betsy DeVos being the education secretary, but charter schools are not for profit.
That's right. They are nonprofit
they're public schools.
schools.
Right. They just get money, and most of them actually get less money from per student than traditional public schools.
That's right. Well, the unions think that anything that isn't run by the government is for profit, and they've managed also to vilify the backers of charter schools, which usually are wealthy philanthropists.
Well, in West Virginia, that's not a left-leaning state anymore. It's voted for Trump. Jim Justice, Republican governor, used to be a Democrat, changed to Republican. I think the Republicans were moving this reform bill, and yet he came out, almost before they went on strike, to surrender essentially and say, I'll veto the bill. So why in a state that's right-leaning and, as Dan says, underperforming, would he capitulate so quickly?
I mean, I think that's the question for him. For sure, West Virginia has a strong labor presence. But yeah, what he's done is essentially give the teachers union a veto over legislation. It's a huge surrender, I think. And I would like to see the school choice advocates be a little bit more forceful, because at the end of the day, you've got these teachers going on strike claiming it's about the children, and that's hogwash. If you look at how these schools are performing, it does an enormous disservice, particularly to the most vulnerable students, not to give them more options.
Well, and this is not universal across the country, Dan, because we have the example of Florida, where which has a very expansive school choice program, and which Ron DeSantis, the current governor, used to his advantage politically. There's some polling that suggests that